This video continues our work with graphing. We're going to review a little bit about domain and range and intervals, and then we're going to move on to some other intervals that we haven't discussed and other terminology related to graphs. This is section 1-1, day 2. So first of all, to review a little bit, using this graph, domain and range, if you recall, domain reflects the x values of a graph. So the domain on this one, if we look at it, these are the x values. So the x values here, if you look at the way this graph goes off to the left, it has an arrow on it. So as we go to the left, that arrow means you don't stop at the -7 here. It keeps going. So when we look at the domain for this, you look at -infinity is where you go off to the left side because it keeps going with the arrow. Now to the right, so as we move to the right, it ends at 8. So when we put the right-hand side of this one, we actually just put an 8 and it ends there, it includes it, so we put a bracket to include it. So our domain has to do with from -infinity to 8. Our range, on the other hand, are the y values. Those are what we do going up and down, are the y values. So if you look at this graph, you want to look at how far down does it go. So for our range, how far down it goes is the lowest is -4 here. So I'm going to go with -4 and it includes that point. So I'm going to go with -4 included. And then when we go to the highest point, notice that it's going up on this direction, going higher, higher, and it keeps going because the arrow implies not only is it going to the left, but it's also going up. And so we have to say that it goes off to infinity. And as we talked about, when you do infinity or -infinity, you put a parentheses on it because you never actually get there. So that's our domain and range. Now, positive and negative intervals, that's talking about, for the positive, this is when it's above the x-axis. And this is when it's below the x-axis. So that's, when you look at above, you're looking at this part of the graph and this little part here. So let's talk about those values. So when we're talking about this interval, so I'll shade that. Let's see, I'm going to shade that now in blue. So let's go ahead and I'll do that in red. So this is positive to there, and this is positive here. That's where it's above the axis. So when I look at my positive intervals, I go from -infinity and I go to -3, but I don't include -3 because it's not positive there, it's 0. So when it's the intercept, -3 is an intercept, you have a 0. This next one is also an intercept, 3. So I'm going to go from 3, and then I go to 6.5 and I stop, and again, don't include either one of those. Now for the negatives, let's go with negatives in green. So the negative part would be this part here and this part here. Now this part goes from -3 to 3 and ends. That's where it's below the axis. And this part starts at 6.5. And then it goes off down to 8 and stops. It doesn't go to infinity. And so there it includes the 8 because that is a negative value and there's a dot there, so it includes it. So let's review over, that is the review over domain and range, positive and negative, in our interval notation. Now let's go ahead and look at something new. Decreasing and increasing. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at this graph here. This is the exact same graph, and look at when it's increasing and decreasing. Increasing means it's going up from left to right. Okay, so we'll go left to right. Decreasing is when it goes down from left to right. Now, so when we look at this, again, we'll shade it. I'm going to go ahead and shade on the increasing. I'll do that one in purple here. So notice increasing here, here's where it starts increasing, and it increases to that spot there. It's decreasing there, increasing here, decreasing there. So when I talk about increasing, it's going to be increasing from negative infinity, because that arrow means it keeps going over this direction. I'm sorry, increasing, I want to use, that's the decreasing part. So increasing starts at an x value of 0, and it goes to an x value of 5, where it's increasing. Decreasing, on the other hand, that's where we go from negative infinity here. It decreases into x equals 0, and then it's also decreasing from 5 to an x value of 8. So when you're giving these intervals, notice that we're giving the x values for the intervals that tell us when the y values are increasing or decreasing, or the x values when the y values are positive or negative. So always give those intervals in x values, just like we did with the domain. All right, now let's look at a new term, minimums and maximums. This is pretty intuitive about what minimum and maximum is. You know, minimum and maximum. Minimum means the lowest part of the graph. So here, this point is the minimum. And we usually say that minimum value is a minimum value of 3, because that's the negative 3, excuse me, that's the lowest point on the graph. This is the maximum value. I might ask you what the x value is at it, but the actual maximum value is 1, 2, 3, 4. Maximum is 4. Now if you look at this one, the maximum here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Here I've got a max at 5. Okay, but here, if you look, there is no minimum value because it just keeps going down further and further. So here, there is no minimum, no min. Okay, so minimums and maximums, pretty intuitive as to what those are in the graph. Now let's look at average rate of change. Average rate of change, what you want to know is how far is, what is the way it's changing between the beginning and the end. So we want to know what the beginning point is. The beginning point here is not an interval, but the ordered pair -2, 2. That's the x and y. And this point here is 3, negative 2. So ordered pairs, not intervals, but ordered pairs here. So what you want to do with average rate of change is think of slope. Between the first point and the last point. So doesn't matter what's going on in between, you take the first point and the last point. A reminder what slope is. Slope equals the difference of the y's, so if you remember, it's been said rise over run, or difference of the y's over difference of the x's, difference of y's over difference of x's. So the difference of the y's, let's go ahead and take this y, -2, and subtract the 2. So -2 minus 2. And over difference of the x's, so 3 minus -2. Make sure if you start with this y, you start with that x on this one. So -2 minus 2 is -4. 3 minus a negative is 3 plus 2. I'm going to write that out. 3 plus 2 when you have minus a negative. So plus 2. And that gives me -4 over 5 for the average rate of change. So when you do average rate of change, take the first point, the last point, and find the slope between them. So we now have some new terminology. We reviewed over domain and range and the positive and negative intervals. We also have here our increasing and decreasing, our minimums, maximums, and what the average rate of change is.